So for my PowerPoint presentation today, I am doing the reliability of the resurrection. So to look at the resurrection as being reliable, we have to look and see where the source it comes from and if that source is reliable. So the New Testament is the main source of where the resurrection story comes from. There are also other secular, non-Christian texts and documents that have evidence of Jesus, the disciples, and that the disciples believed that Jesus was resurrected. But we'll get into that later. So, just strictly looking at the New Testament, one of the main things is the eyewitness testimonies in the New Testament. There are over 140 eyewitness details in the Gospel of John and the second half of the book of Acts. 140. Anytime we look at history, we have to, for things to be reliable, we look at first-hand sources, second-hand sources, and eyewitness, people that were there at the time it happened, and that makes it more reliable. So having 140 eyewitness details, now there's probably only about 7 or 8 direct eyewitnesses that had accounts, but there was over 140 details, which makes that way more reliable. Second thing that's very important is the embarrassing details mentioned in the gospel. Back in ancient times, women were not very high standards and were very looked down upon in society and are not like anything they are seen as today. So we know that men wrote the Gospels and they wrote the New Testament. And in the story of the resurrection, we see the men cowering and hiding out while the women go down to the tomb of Jesus and are brave and basically play the heroes. Now, this wouldn't be something that they would make up in ancient times. If somebody were to make this up in ancient times, they would probably say something along the lines of the men came down, or I came down, I moved the stone away myself, and then I saw Jesus standing there. And then we went and comforted the women. See, this wasn't the case. They didn't do this. They were completely honest, and it was brutally honest. So that's another reason. And this right here, the resurrection was proclaimed very early. This is essential to the credit of reliability that the resurrection has. Most, if not all, of the New Testament documents are written to prior 70 AD. And to put that in context, that's not 70 years after death, because Jesus died around 33 AD, in between 33 AD and 36 AD. That's only 26 years after Jesus's death, and so that's pretty neat. Now that we know the source of the New Testament and where the story of the resurrection comes is reliable, and we can now figure out why the resurrection is reliable as well. So, to look at the resurrection as being reliable, we also have to track back the source from where the story came from and the people that told the story. And so those people were the apostles. And the apostles were not willing to die for a lie. When Jesus was taken into captivity, they scattered and were scared. Peter, who the church was founded and built upon, and who ended up dying a brutal death later in life, denied he was even associated with Jesus. He said it 3 times. 3 times back in ancient times meant completion. It was emphasized of it's complete. I'm telling the truth. I deny him. And so anytime when stuff is referred to in the Bible or ancient times back then, saying it 3 times was an emphasis of being I'm done, I'm over it. So that was really, it's interesting that Peter denied him 3 days before. No, he denied him 3 times before the crucifixion, but was willing to die for him right after the crucifixion. And it wasn't just him, it was all the disciples. And another thing is the Apostle Paul. He persecuted Christians, hunted them down, and killed them. Jews that believed in Jesus and that he was the Messiah and he resurrected from the dead. The thing that Paul hated most, was the whole resurrection story of Jesus. He thought Jesus wasn't who he said he was. And so Paul had this encounter with what he believes there was the resurrected Christ. And this encounter fits perfectly with the timeline of Christianity and how it matches up. Because the accounts of the resurrection started right after the resurrection. The resurrection was being taught right after Jesus' death and crucifixion, and 3 days later. So we know that Paul was Saul, and he became Paul, and he stopped persecuting Christians between 33 AD and 36 AD, which is interesting enough, is the same time they believe the crucifixion was. So that's very cool to know that. Next is James. He's a big one. He was Jesus's biological brother and didn't even believe that Jesus was who he said he was until after he was crucified. So this is a little graphic of how the apostles died. So you see Matthew, he was impaled by spears in Ethiopia. James was thrown off a wall, then clubbed to death. Jude was crucified by Magi in Persia. John died in exile by himself. Obviously, the most wanted death out of all these, I would assume. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded. Philip was hung by iron hooks upside down. Peter was crucified upside down by Nero. Thomas was stabbed with a spear in India. James was beheaded in Palestine. Simon was crucified in Persia. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. And Bartholomew was flayed to death by whip in Asia Minor. So obviously, the disciples, knowing this was a lie, knowing they were going to die brutal deaths, would not have died for a lie, and they would not have continued to spread it, and all they had to do was deny that it was true, and they still wouldn't. Next, we have non-biblical sources and biblical sources that predict Jesus's resurrection, life, death, and resurrection. So there are 10 ancient non-Christian sources out there that account for Jesus's story. They say the same basic story of the gospel and Jesus, and that his apostles and disciples believed that he was raised from the dead, and they were willing to die a brutal death for that. Now, all 10 of these accounts were written 150 years or less after Jesus' death, which makes it also more accurate. And so when there are non-Christian sources, the question that I'll leave with you guys is, how can this story be made up? Next is the biblical source of Isaiah 53. If you haven't read Isaiah 53 and you're interested in this, I highly recommend going and reading Isaiah 53. It's a perfect and uncanny picture of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And the funny thing is, it was written 700 years before Jesus was born and walked the face of the earth. But yet, it explains Jesus' life, death, and resurrection 700 years before Jesus was born, which is awesome. It was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are some of the oldest ancient texts on hand of non-biblical and biblical sources put together, and it's sought to be one of the most reliable and most copies. Next, Tacitus was a Roman historian. He was a Roman senator as well, and he kept record of things that happened in Rome. And the picture that you see in the background is some of his text that he wrote on Jesus. He wrote of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. And so there's another non-biblical source also included. To recap this whole thing, there's a lot more evidence, and I would definitely recommend going out and looking for that. But in conclusion, there's 6 main details that you take away from this, and these are things that atheists, naturalists, and people that just don't believe this happened will not argue. 1, that is, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, his disciples had experience that they believed was the risen Jesus that died brutal deaths because of this. 3, the world has been turned upside down because of the resurrection. 4, resurrection was proclaimed very early, and lots of early and often, really important. 5, James was a non-believer and then a believer after the death of Jesus. Same thing with Paul. He was a non-believer and then goes to a believer after the death of Jesus. These 6 things no person can argue with because they're proven facts, and this is, I hope you have a leg to stand on and solid information, and are a little more educated about the resurrection. So thank you.